Welcome to Unwrap Reality, where we narrate stories on things that happen in real life.
You ever think about how one moment can change everything? I sure didn't. For most of my life, I've been Ethan Cole, the guy who had it all figured out. My world revolved around precision, control, and success. Every decision was calculated, every move deliberate. I built an empire from nothing, climbing higher than anyone thought possible. And yet, there I was, sitting in my office overlooking the city I'd conquered, staring at a letter that made me feel like the ground beneath me had just disappeared. It wasn't a business deal gone wrong or some scandal, it was something far more personal, something I never saw coming. The letter arrived on what seemed like any ordinary day. At first glance, it looked unremarkable, tucked among invoices and meeting reminders. But as soon as I opened it, I knew this wasn't your typical correspondence. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. Your son is looking for you. Son? What son? I read it again, slower this time, trying to make sense of it. There was no mistaking the intent behind those carefully chosen words. Whoever wrote this wasn't joking, and they weren't lying either. A rush of questions flooded my mind. How could I have a child I didn't know about? Was this some kind of cruel prank? Or worse, was it true? I spent years building walls around myself, ensuring nothing could disrupt the life I worked so hard to create. But now, sitting there with that letter trembling in my hands, I realized those walls might not be as impenetrable as I thought. This wasn't just another problem to solve, it was something deeper, something raw. Something I couldn't ignore. Whatever happened next, I knew one thing for certain: my life would never be the same again. I'll never forget the moment I opened that letter. It was late in the evening, and my office felt unusually quiet, just the faint hum of the city outside my window. The envelope had arrived earlier that day, slipped among invoices and meeting reminders, but something about it caught my attention. No return address, no name, just my own scrawled across the front in handwriting I didn't recognize. When I finally tore it open, the words hit me like a punch to the gut: your son is looking for you. My hands froze mid-motion, and for a second, I thought I'd misread it. But as soon as I unfolded the paper inside, I knew this wasn't your typical correspondence. Whoever wrote this wasn't joking, and they weren't lying either. A rush of questions flooded my mind. How could I have a child I didn't know about? Why hadn't Rachel told me? Was this some kind of cruel prank? Or worse, was it true? The letter contained more than just those chilling words. Tucked inside was a photograph, a younger version of myself standing next to Rachel, the woman I dated briefly years ago. Her smile was warm, familiar, yet distant now, as if she belonged to another lifetime entirely. Alongside the photo were hospital records confirming what the letter claimed: Jake, the boy reaching out to me, was biologically mine. I stared at the evidence spread out on my desk, trying to process how this could have happened without me ever knowing. Had Rachel kept this secret intentionally? Did she think I wouldn't care? Or had she tried to tell me, only to be met with silence on my end? Each possibility weighed heavier than the last, pressing down on me until I could barely breathe. At first, all I could do was sit there, staring at the proof laid out before me. This wasn't just an unexpected twist, it was a seismic shift in everything I thought I knew about my life. For years, I had prided myself on being untouchable, invincible, someone who controlled every aspect of his world. But now, sitting there with that letter trembling in my hands, I realized those walls might not be as impenetrable as I thought. This wasn't just about logistics or responsibility, it was about loss, regret, and the haunting realization that I might have missed years of someone else's life. Someone who shared my DNA. Someone who needed me now more than ever. As the weight of it settled over me, I realized I couldn't ignore this. If Jake was telling the truth, and everything pointed to him being exactly who he claimed, I owed it to him to find out why he reached out. More importantly, I owed it to myself to figure out how I'd let this happen without even realizing it. Whatever came next, I knew one thing for certain: nothing would ever be the same again. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was waiting for me. The letter had thrown my entire world into disarray, and there was only one way to get answers: meet this boy who claimed to be my son. After verifying the authenticity of the documents through a private investigator, a move born out of habit rather than trust, I arranged to meet him at a quiet cafe downtown. It wasn't too far from where I lived, but secluded enough to avoid prying eyes. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting by the window with his headphones on. He looked up briefly as the door chimed, then went back to scrolling through his phone. My first thought? He's just a kid. A teenager trying to navigate life without much guidance. But beneath the hoodie and the indifferent posture, I could see traces of myself, younger, angrier, more lost. His name was Jake, and if the DNA test results were accurate, he was undeniably mine. I approached cautiously, unsure of how to start. "Jake?" I said, my voice steadier than I expected. He glanced up again, this time holding my gaze longer. There was no warmth in his expression, just a guarded curiosity. "You're Ethan Cole," he stated flatly, almost like he was reading lines from a script. I nodded, pulling out the chair across from him. "Yeah, that's me." We sat in silence for a moment, the kind that feels heavy with unspoken questions. Finally, I broke it. "Look, I don't know what you've been told or how much you know about all this. But I want to understand." Jake shrugged, leaning back in his seat. "There's not much to tell. Mom died 6 months ago. She left some letters behind, one of them was for you." His tone was clipped, matter of fact, but I could hear the cracks beneath the surface. This wasn't just about logistics, it was about loss. As we talked, pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. His mother, Rachel, had kept his existence a secret because she didn't think I'd care, or worse, that I'd try to take him away. She raised him alone, working multiple jobs to make ends meet while shielding him from the truth about his father. When she passed, Jake found the letters and decided to reach out, not because he wanted anything from me, but because he needed closure. Or maybe, deep down, he wanted to know if I'd even show up. By the end of our conversation, I realized 2 things. First, Jake wasn't here to forgive me or bond over shared bloodlines. Second, whether I liked it or not, I owed him more than just an explanation. I owed him a chance to know me, to decide for himself if I was worth keeping around. As we stood to leave, he muttered something under his breath. "What was that?" I asked. He hesitated before repeating louder. I said, "Don't flake on me now." It wasn't a plea or a demand, it was a challenge. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely invested in proving someone wrong. I couldn't stop thinking about the letter and the boy who had handed it to me. Jake. His name echoed in my mind like a question I didn't know how to answer. The next morning, I found myself sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the photo of Rachel and me. It was strange, looking at her now felt like looking at a ghost. She was frozen in time, smiling up at me with an expression I hadn't seen in years. But this wasn't just nostalgia, it was regret. Regret for the choices I'd made, the bridges I'd burned, and the people I'd left behind without a second thought. As I sat there, memories started flooding back, pieces of my past I'd buried under layers of ambition and success. Rachel and I had been young when we met, both chasing dreams bigger than ourselves. We were reckless, passionate, and utterly convinced we could conquer the world together. But life has a way of pulling people apart, and soon enough, our paths diverged. I told myself it was mutual, that we wanted different things, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had chosen my career over her. Over us. And now, staring at that picture, I realized she might have been carrying more than just heartbreak when she walked away. The deeper I dug into my own history, the clearer it became why Jake existed in the first place. Back then, I was consumed by work, pouring every ounce of energy into building my empire. Relationships were secondary, distractions I couldn't afford. When Rachel disappeared from my life, I didn't chase after her. I told myself she'd moved on, that she was better off without me. What I hadn't considered, not even for a second, was that she might have needed me. That he might have needed me. But what hit me hardest wasn't the guilt or the missed opportunities. It was the realization that I had built my entire identity around being untouchable, invincible. I prided myself on controlling every aspect of my life, yet here I was, completely blindsided by something I couldn't have predicted. For the first time, I understood what it meant to be vulnerable, to face the consequences of your actions not in boardrooms or contracts, but in human lives. Lives I had unknowingly shaped and neglected. By the time I finally stood up from my desk, the sun was setting outside my office window. I grabbed my coat and headed out, needing fresh air to clear my head. As I walked through the quiet streets, one thing became painfully obvious: if I wanted to understand Jake, I had to confront the parts of my past I'd spent decades trying to forget. Because whether I liked it or not, he was a part of me. And maybe, just maybe, I owed it to both of us to figure out where we went wrong, and where we could go from here. The days turned into weeks, and the more time I spent with Jake, the clearer it became that this wasn't going to be easy. He wasn't the kind of kid who wore his heart on his sleeve. Every interaction felt like a test, a way for him to gauge whether I was serious about sticking around or if I'd eventually slip back into the life I had before he walked into it. At first, I thought I could fix things by throwing money at the problem. I hired tutors, enrolled him in extracurricular activities, even redecorated his room exactly how he wanted it. But none of that seemed to matter. What Jake needed, what he craved, was something I didn't know how to give: trust. It started small. One evening, after another long day at work, I came home to find him sitting alone in the living room, staring at the TV but not really watching anything. The house was quiet, too quiet, and for a moment, I wondered if he even noticed I was there. "Hey," I said, tossing my keys onto the counter. He glanced up briefly, then went back to whatever was holding his attention. I hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Normally, I'd retreat to my office, bury myself in emails, and wait for the day to reset itself. But something stopped me this time. Maybe it was the way he sat there, so still, like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Or maybe it was the realization that I couldn't keep treating him like just another obligation. I grabbed a soda from the fridge and sat down on the couch beside him. "What's up?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. He shrugged, avoiding eye contact. "Nothing." It was the same answer he gave every time I asked, but this time, I didn't let it drop. "Come on," I pressed gently. "You can tell me." For a while, he stayed silent, picking at the label on his water bottle. Then, finally, he spoke. "I don't know. Everything feels weird." Weird. That one word hit harder than I expected. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was vulnerability, raw and unfiltered. And it made me realize just how much he was struggling to adjust to this new reality. Over the next few weeks, I made an effort to spend more time with him, not because I felt obligated, but because I genuinely wanted to understand him. We started taking drives together on weekends, exploring parts of the city neither of us had seen before. Sometimes we'd stop at random places, a diner here, a park there, and just talk. About school, about music, about anything that came to mind. Slowly but surely, those walls he'd built around himself began to crack. He laughed more often, opened up a little more each day, and even started asking questions about my life. Questions I hadn't thought about in years. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments when the tension between us flared up again, usually over something trivial like chores or curfews. Jake would lash out, accusing me of trying to control him, and I'd snap back, frustrated by his defiance. Yet even in those heated exchanges, there was progress. We were learning how to navigate this strange new dynamic, figuring out where the boundaries lay and how to respect them. By the end of the month, I realized something important: building trust wasn't about fixing everything overnight. It was about showing up, day after day, and proving that I wasn't going anywhere. I couldn't stop thinking about what Sophie had said that night: "You don't smile a lot, do you?" It wasn't just her words, it was the way she looked at me, like she was trying to figure out who I really was beneath all the layers I'd built around myself. For years, I had convinced myself that my past didn't matter, that it was irrelevant to the person I had become. But now, sitting in my penthouse with Jake testing boundaries and asking questions I didn't know how to answer, I realized something unsettling: the man I used to be still shaped the choices I made today. It started with small things, memories I hadn't thought about in decades creeping back into my mind. Like the time I walked away from Rachel after our last argument, too stubborn to admit I might have been wrong. Or the countless nights I spent working late instead of building something real with someone who actually mattered. Back then, I told myself I was doing what needed to be done, sacrificing personal connections for professional success. But now, looking at Jake, I saw the cracks in that logic. Every decision I'd ever made, all those moments where I chose work over people, had led me here. To him. One evening, after another long day of navigating this new dynamic, I decided to dig deeper. Not because I wanted to relive the past, but because I needed to understand it. I called an old friend, someone who had known me when I was younger, before I became the version of myself everyone recognized today. His name was Marcus, and though we hadn't spoken in years, he answered on the second ring. "Ethan Cole," he said, his tone half joking, half surprised. "To what do I owe this unexpected pleasure?" I hesitated, unsure of how to phrase what I was feeling. "I need your help," I admitted finally. "There's someone in my life now. Someone important. And I think understanding my past might help me figure out how to be better for them." Marcus didn't laugh or tease me like I expected him to. Instead, he listened quietly as I explained everything: Rachel, Jake, the letter, the whirlwind of emotions I hadn't anticipated. When I finished, there was a long pause before he spoke. "You've always been good at running towards something, Ethan," he said. "But maybe it's time you stopped running from yourself." That conversation stayed with me long after we hung up. The next morning, I found myself standing outside the storage unit where I kept boxes of old photos, letters, and mementos I hadn't touched in years. I hadn't planned to come here, it was almost like my feet had carried me without consulting my brain. As I sifted through the contents, memories flooded back in waves. Letters from Rachel, concert ticket stubs, even a mixtape she'd made me once. Each item felt like a piece of a puzzle I hadn't realized was incomplete. And then I found it, a journal I'd kept during those early years, filled with scribbled notes, half-formed ideas, and fleeting thoughts about the future. Flipping through the pages, I was struck by how different I sounded back then. There was hope in those words, ambition tempered by optimism. Somewhere along the way, I had lost that balance, trading dreams for deals and relationships for results. Closing the journal, I realized something important: if I wanted to move forward, if I wanted to truly connect with Jake, I had to confront the parts of myself I'd buried long ago. By the time I left the storage unit, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I didn't have all the answers yet, but for the first time in years, I felt like I was asking the right questions. I'll never forget the first time Jake and I worked on something together, something that wasn't just about survival or obligation, but about creating something meaningful. It started with a simple idea, a short film. At first, I thought it was just another one of his teenage hobbies, something he'd lose interest in after a week. But the more he talked about it, the more I realized how serious he was. He had notebooks filled with ideas, sketches of scenes, even snippets of dialogue scribbled in the margins. For someone who had spent most of his life focused on numbers and contracts, seeing this level of passion was refreshing. One evening, after dinner, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with him, surrounded by papers and storyboards. "So, what's the story about?" I asked, genuinely curious. Jake hesitated for a moment before launching into an explanation. The film was about a boy who discovers a hidden world inside his grandfather's old clock shop, a place where time doesn't exist, and every decision creates a new reality. It was ambitious, imaginative, and completely unlike anything I would have come up with. But as he spoke, I could see the excitement in his eyes, the way he lit up when he described each scene. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was just his father, I felt like I was part of his world. Over the next few weeks, we threw ourselves into the project. I helped him write the script, offering suggestions while trying not to impose my own style too much. He handled the creative side, directing, casting friends from school, even composing some of the music. Meanwhile, I took care of the logistics, renting equipment, securing locations, making sure everything ran smoothly behind the scenes. It wasn't always easy, there were disagreements, moments of frustration, and more than a few late nights, but through it all, something incredible happened. We weren't just working on a film anymore, we were building a bridge between us. The day of the screening arrived faster than either of us expected. We hosted it at a local community center, inviting friends, family, and anyone else who wanted to watch. As the lights dimmed and the opening scene played, I glanced over at Jake. He was sitting on the edge of his seat, gripping the armrests like he was holding onto a roller coaster. When the credits rolled and the audience erupted into applause, he turned to me, his face glowing with pride. "We did it," he said, almost breathless. But the real moment of clarity came later that night, as we cleaned up the venue together. Jake stopped mid-task, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For believing in me." Those 4 words hit harder than I expected, forcing me to confront how far we'd come since that awkward meeting at the cafe. This wasn't just redemption for him, it was redemption for me too. Because in helping him chase his dreams, I had rediscovered pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. By the time the film festival rolled around, I felt like I was standing on the edge of something big, something that could either lift me higher or knock me flat on my back. The community center where we were screening the short film buzzed with energy. Friends, family, and even a few local filmmakers had gathered to watch what Jake and I had created together. It wasn't just a project anymore, it was proof of how far we'd come since that awkward first meeting at the cafe. As the lights dimmed and the opening scene played, I glanced over at Jake. He sat on the edge of his seat, gripping the armrest like he was holding onto a roller coaster. His eyes darted between the screen and the audience, gauging reactions, searching for signs of approval. When the credits rolled and the room erupted into applause, he turned to me, his face glowing with pride. "We did it," he said, almost breathless. But the real moment of clarity came later that night, as we cleaned up the venue together. Jake stopped mid-task, looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen before. "Thanks," he said quietly. "For believing in me." Those 4 words hit harder than I expected, forcing me to confront how far we'd come since that awkward meeting at the cafe. This wasn't just redemption for him, it was redemption for me too. Because in helping him chase his dreams, I had rediscovered pieces of myself I thought I'd lost forever. The next morning, as I stood on the balcony of my penthouse overlooking the city, I realized something profound. For years, I had defined success by wealth, power, and control. But now, watching the sunrise paint the skyline in hues of gold and pink, I understood that true fulfillment came from something entirely different. It came from connection, from being part of someone else's journey and letting them become part of yours. Jake walked out onto the balcony, interrupting my thoughts. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, leaning against the railing. I smiled, shaking my head. Just, how much has changed? He nodded, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. Yeah, he said softly. Me too. In that quiet moment, I knew one thing for certain: life doesn't give us second chances often, but when it does, we have to take them. And sometimes, those second chances come wrapped in unexpected packages, like a letter, a boy, and a story waiting to be told.